Good afternoon, Northern Europe, and welcome to this week's episode of the News Bulletin. It's a pleasure to be able hosting you today without my partner in crime. Unfortunately, Oscar is not here. He's busy talking with all of our partners at the moment back in Amsterdam, but he'll be back next time. My name is Alexandra. I am an account strategist for the Google Marketing Solutions team, working for the Belgian market, which is also where I'm from, which you can probably hear by now. Looking at the topics we'll be covering today. So today we're kicking off our automation subject. So we'll be covering this for this news bulletin and also the next one. And after that, we'll be moving on to attribution. And just before that, we were talking about audiences. So really trying to tackle the AAA before the end of the year here. When it comes to automation today, we'll be answering a couple of frequently asked questions that I suddenly hear quite often coming back from our partners. Then moving on to a little bit of a case study of actually a Brazilian company that really applied the double win of attribution and automation to get better results. We'll be moving on to product updates. There's only one this week, but it's a pretty major one. It's the launch of a new ad format, which is the responsive display ads. And then last but not least, as every bulletin, will be taking some questions if I'm the best one to answer them. If not, I'll refer you to the best person to do so. But feel free to just send in your questions during the live stream, and I'll get to them towards the end of the session. All right, kicking it off with automation. So I think automation is, a very essential part of digital marketing, and it's only growing in importance. But as automation gets more complex, there are just more complex questions that arises as well. So what we're trying to do today is just tackle four very common questions of different pillars of automation. Now, I can imagine that you're full of a lot of different questions. Feel free to send them in now, or just have that conversation with your content point at Google. We are very passionate about the subject of automation because we truly believe that a road towards automation will just free up a lot of time and skills to do very value-adding tasks. So we're always very much happy and ready to answer any of your automation questions. Kicking it off is actually with the dynamic search ads campaign question in general. I think the most recurring question we get here is about the ideal setup, whether you should set up a DSA campaign as a standalone campaign or as part of a hybrid campaign as an ad group. So there's really no right or wrong answer here. Both are absolutely fine. It kind of depends on your objectives or what you can share within a campaign or not. So if you need to have different budgets, different targeting, and different bidding strategies for a dynamic search activity compared to a standard search activity, then you're better off just splitting it off into different campaigns. If you're fine with keeping a same budget, bidding, and targeting method within all of your search activities, so hybrids of the standard and dynamic one, then you can consider just adding it as an ad group. This was previously not possible. So the possibility to add DSA as an ad group was launched this summer, and I've actually seen some great success and cases with that type of implementation. But if we look at a separate campaign setup first, so what you'll be looking at if you were to, for example, only have two different campaigns, so the standard search and the dynamic search campaign, typically, we would recommend having a higher campaign budget and also a higher target on the standard search campaign, and then a lower campaign budget and a lower target on the dynamic campaign. So in this case, the campaign that has the dynamic ads really just serves kind of like a keyword expansion tool, but also another kind of safety bucket to cover all your bases. So for example, you could have like a quite broad keywords within your search, but then if you target landing pages that are also already repriced in your standard campaign, then you're making sure that whatever a user was looking for and that you have to offer within your website is being shown, and that while having very different objectives when it comes to your budget and how it's going to be rolled out. If then you were to set up a hybrid campaign, you can take kind of an average of the budget that you would split up otherwise, and same thing when the target. And here you're again just covering all your bases, with the main difference being that you're just having like one budget for all of your search activity. There are also additional targeting methods that were introduced to DSAs this summer that gives you more or less control over the areas you want to target, but also the possibility to cover more bases when it comes to keywords. So for example, we added a targeting method like URL is, which will enable you to really target your DSA on a very specific URL. Another targeting method that was added was the landing pages from ad groups, which helps or enables you to then target only the landing pages that you're already advertising for, which is also quite interesting, because I think one of the worries that we might get with DSAs is that you will actually target pages like contact pages or store locators, which is not what you're trying to advertise for. So if you choose more narrow targeting methods, you'll be just making sure that you move that problem out of the way and have control over what you want to target. That's also going to limit your reach at some point. So that's a bit of the trade-off you have to make. The more control you want to do your targeting, the more defined and secluded your reach will be. Second question we wanted to tackle today is about the best practices when it comes to smart bidding in the first place, but also bid modifiers. So I think that's also kind of bad on our side. We had so many product updates when it comes to smart bidding and also bid modifiers that it might be a little bit tricky to keep up with what's the best implementation now. So let's get a look at that. So when it comes to smart bidding, the initial best practices are really around budget. There are two things you want to make sure here. First of all is that the delivery method of your budget is set on standard and not accelerated. Because when it comes to accelerated, and if you are already in a situation where your budget might not fulfill your needs, at some point of the day, you're really just closing shop, and that's definitely going to hurt the performance of your smart bidding strategy. Whether if you have a standard delivery method, it will even out your budgets more evenly during the day, allowing you to really be present at any type of queries during the day. The second point, which I also just mentioned, is the fact of having unlimited or capped campaigns, because that constraint on a budget or a constraint on a campaign will of course also have an impact on your smart bidding, especially if it's target CPA or target ROAS. Only maximize conversion is adapted for campaigns that are currently constrained. So if you are currently constraining your campaign, but you want to experiment with smart bidding and have a focus of really getting as much conversions in for the budget that you have, I would highly suggest and advise to move on to maximize conversions. The second part of the best practices is around keywords. So first of all, you want to make sure that you keep on expanding your keywords. You can use tools like a search term report, but also a keyword planner, for example, or move on to broad match modifier to really just expand your reach a little bit and give your bid strategy like a larger set of variation to be able to test on and optimize on. The second point is also related to your attribution model. So if you change your attribution model recently, one of the first really like instincts you should have after that is look at keywords that are more upper funnel and broader that have been paused in the past, and make sure that you unpause them or add them if you just don't have them in the account yet. Next best practice is concerning ad variation. You want to make sure that you're testing different ad variations so you can always provide a very tailored ad text for the user. There are so many different types of users, different online personas that respond to different ad texts. Never forget that part of the experiment, because that's really interesting, and that's also a good way to learn more about your audience, is to which the ad text they respond. And then the last part when it comes to best practices has to do with the learning period. So to make sure or avoid to have your bid strategy go back into learning period, you have to make sure that when it comes to changes, you do them incrementally. So one set of big changes you can do are related to bids and targets or budgets. So if you wanted to, for example, change your daily budget, make sure that you only do that in incrementalities of 10%. Same thing for your target. So if you want to change, like increase your target CPA, for example, or lower your target CPA, only do that in increments of 10% a day. And last but not least, same when it comes to like anything that's related to like share budget, portfolio budgets, because that will, if you make big changes, that would almost automatically force the system into going back into learning, which also has an impact on the performance, like we will also see in a moment. The second part of type of big changes you could make is anything that's related to the ad text and keywords. So it's the same thing here. If you want to make any adaptations, make sure that you do that in small baby steps. So ad text, only change like a couple amounts of text words in an ad text at a time. Or when it comes to keywords, only add a couple of them, a handful, a dozen of keywords at a time. So you kind of minimize the risk of the smart bidding system to go back into learning. When it comes to bid modifiers, here's this kind of a clear overview of which bid modifiers are compatible with which smart bidding strategy. So looking at enhanced CPC bidding strategy, it will take into account bid modifiers like a geographic one, RLSA, demographics, or time modifier, and they will be applied before the eCPC bid. However, we strongly suggest that when you're starting out with an eCPC in general, that you start with a 0% bid modifier, because those signals are already taken into account in the eCPC strategy. And furthermore, it's just better to find out about what works or what doesn't work in a very neutral environment without those modifiers built into the system from the get-go. eCPC, though, will not take different conversion rates for different devices into account. So that means that when it comes to devices, you will always have to keep a bid modifier if that makes sense for the business of the advertiser. Moving on to target cost per acquisition, here all bid modifiers will be ignored unless they are at minus 100%, and except if it is a device bid adjustment. But the device bid adjustment here for a target CPA will really more adapt the target rather than the bid. And then last but not least, the target return on ad spend. Here as well, all bid modifiers will be ignored except minus 100% bid modifiers on devices and demographics. So I think this is a very quite clear overview of which bid modifiers work with which smart bidding strategies. And just if there are any updates when it comes to that, you will always find out about it on notifications within your account or even via email. But again, feel all free to ask all the questions you need when it comes to that. Moving on to the next FAQ has to do with the link between smart bidding and attribution. So before we even get into that, and this is mostly about attribution, there is one report within any Google Ads account which I find extremely interesting, and that is the search attribution report, because it's kind of your only insights into the consumer funnel, consumer path that has actually already shown itself for your advertiser, what you've been advertising for within your account. So within that search attribution report, which you can find under tools in a Google Ads account, there are two metrics that you can find that are particularly interesting when you're trying to rethink your attribution model. The first one is the time lag report. So the time lag will show you how many days it takes from either a first impression on an ad or the first click on an ad to a conversion. So we can see for this account that on average it takes about 15 days from the first click to a full conversion. So you can already tell that this is quite a complex and long purchasing path, which will entail a lot of different touch points, which you can see in the second metric, which is the path length. So the path length will give you the average number of clicks or impressions it takes before you have a conversion. So in this account, it's the same account, same report, just different metrics. You see that it took on average 7.5 to almost 8 impressions on an ad before someone converted. So we already knew that the purchasing path is long in terms of time and days, but now we also know that the touch points are necessary, and there are multiple touch points during that path, which also kind of represents the complexity of that consumer journey. So once you know that, your first reflex should really be to, if you are on a last click attribution model, to switch away from it, because you know that there are different touch points in that funnel, so it's important that you credit them every touch point differently during that purchasing path or consumer journey. So if you were to move away from last click attribution, we usually recommend you take at least 30 days then before you can analyze some of the data that came in, and never use recent days, especially, so for example, we saw that the conversion cycle here was of about 14 days. Then that means that you still have to wait 14 days until conversions come in. So take that into account. But changing your attribution model is not going to be everything. It's not the end of the journey. It's actually very much the first step. So once you've changed your attribution model, that the kind of newly accredited data has come into the account, what needs to be done is like a revisit of your bids and budget, but also make sure that you have some expectation management in place to know that your automated bidding strategy, if it was already in place, will take some time to adjust to this new attribution model and the data that therefore has been adjusted as well. So there's kind of two scenarios here. If you were to start out with attribution and smart bidding, there's a couple of steps we would recommend. So first of all, if you're still manual CPC and on last click, the first thing you want to change is your attribution model. So work on that first and then move on to smart bidding, because if you change your attribution model first, that means that you gave your future smart bidding already better data to optimize on. Second step is to really take that conversion cycle into account. So we usually recommend that after you change an attribution model, you take at least 14 days plus 2 to 4 times the conversion cycle before you transition to smart bidding. So the example here, if it takes 5 days to purchase and you take 2 conversion cycles, so that's 10 days plus the 14 days basis, it means you will wait 24 days of new data before you move on to smart bidding. We recommend that you wouldn't change your attribution model during a highly seasonal moment for your advertiser, just because you want to have kind of neutral representative data to be able to make your decision on. And changing your conversion tags has the same implications as changing your attribution model. So if your conversion tags are being changed, just make sure that you wait the same amount of time. So you take those 14 days and 2 to 4 conversion cycles before you move on to a smart bidding strategy. The second scenario is that you're already active on smart bidding and then you want to change to attribution model, which is something I actually see more often because I think we're only very recently raising the awareness when it comes to attribution. So the two most important things when changing your attribution after an already implemented smart bidding is to make sure that the expectations are right. Expectation when it comes to the time, but also the volatility that the change will bring about to your performance. So we want to make sure that the end client you're working with, the end advertiser you're working with, knows of the changing you're about to make, and that it will impact the performance and that it will most probably set back the bidding strategy into a learning period, which will have, of course, like an impact on the conversion volumes. Second of all, especially anything like target CPA or target ROAS are quite sensible to these type of changes, so they will most likely be impacted. And then when it comes to comparing performances, again, make sure that you take into account at least 2 to 4, recommend 3 conversion cycles before you can really compare the impact of that attribution model change. And once you do that, because you will see different performances, rethink your targets. So if you have to take like increase or decrease your target cost per acquisition or your target return on ad spend, that is like a natural flow of the process. The performance has changed, so maybe the targets needs to be changed. Because as was mentioned previously in the other best practices, just do those changes incrementally. So only 10% changes at a time to avoid any further learning days for your smart bidding. Last FAQ I want to tackle here today is concerning the bid strategy report. I think it's also a little bit of a underutilized report, kind of like the search attribution report, but there's also like a very important way or factor is the way you look and you read a bid strategy report, which I just want to run through with you. So first of all, where do you find this report? You find it when you are in the campaigns tab and you look at the bid strategy type. Usually it's clickable if you have a smart bidding strategy, and then it brings you the bid strategy report. So the first thing you will see in a bid strategy report is kind of a summary tab. The summary tab will give you the target metric your customer, advertiser, or the Google partner has set. So we can see in this example that the target was one of a 50% return on ad spend. And then the summary will give you, as a first metric, the average return on ad spend that was optimized or achieved during the selected time period. The second metric will be the actual return on ad spend, so not the average but targets, but the actual return on ad spend for that same time period. What is essential here is the time period. So if we take this example, it's quite important that you note that, for example, here we took 60 days to make an evaluation from July 28th until September 25th. So that is a pretty broad period, and probably, or maybe there was an experiment going on, or it's just like a full switch, and we're assessing the full 60 days. However, it is extremely important that you actually assess the performance of that bidding strategy on periods where there were not any issues that were signaled. So maybe the 60 days are too long to be able to really assess the performance of the bidding strategy. If we take this example here, we can see that from the 60 days, there are almost 30 days where the bidding strategy is either in learning method, so at the beginning of the strategy or after a big change in budget. And there's also a time where the campaign was constrained. So the limits of the budget was reached, which, as we all know, has a pretty big impact on smart bidding. So what is really key here is that you make sure that you're assessing on the right time frame. So if I were to look at the right period to make my decisions on, it's here in this case. It's not from July 28th until September 25th. It's from August 7th until August 29th. So that is the green period here on the time frame, which is the only period where there are no issues signaled, which means that the smart bidding is actually running at its best and how it should. So once we know that, we change the time frame or the time periods on the Google Ads to then see at the performance. And if we look previously, the average return on ad spend that was achieved was of 48%. However, during the time frame where the smart bidding was performing as it should, we did reach the target of 50%, and the actual return on ad spend was one of 66% over that period. So the question here is, has the change been successful? When looking at the right time frame, the answer is absolutely yes. And why am I saying yes? Very simply, because the actual return or performance that was achieved was higher than the targets that was given to the system. So that is a successful switch or experiment, in my opinion, and I guess most people as well. But you can tell that what has been essential here when it comes to processing and analyzing the switch is the time frame. So I can only really stress this out one more time. Make sure that you're looking at the right dates and that you're on the same page with your end advertiser or the client you're working with or any other partners you are involved with, that everyone's looking at the same time frame. And you can also set the expectation beforehand of, look, this is what we'll be looking at, not the full period, but the period where everything was running as it should, where we were not ramping up because of any learning moment, because of any kickoff or any changes in budget, like really the time where the system was performing as it should. Moving on to a little bit of a case study of Brazilian company Zap. So Zap is actually a company that offers solutions to Brazilians to find property. So they're really into the real estate vertical. And they had as a goal to really keep on achieving and sustaining a growth target, actually double-digit growth, and make sure that they would increase their conversions across platforms, but they wanted to keep the efficiency, which meant lowering or having at least the same cost per acquisition. So what they decided to do was, first of all, utilize dynamic search ads to fill in any keywords gaps that they might have. Then they moved on to DDA, so data-driven attribution, which is really the crème de la crème when it comes to attribution models. Once they had the proper data coming in from based on a new attribution model, they moved on to a smart bidding strategy, which was a target CPA. So all of this really just enabled Zap to attribute the proper value to any upper funnel efforts. And once they did that, they were able to then redistribute the credit of the different touch points in the funnel, which helped them understand what the path was towards their conversions. that also led in quite incredible results of an increase in 15% of conversions overall, but especially on computers, they had an increase of 20%, and they managed to decrease their cost per acquisition of 23%, which also just kind of proves the efficiency of the strategy, which is great. So we have Camilla here, the marketing manager of Zap, that mentioned that using only the last click of a journey to a conversion was not an effective metric, and that monitoring the entire consumer path in order to assign values to each channel was influencing the results positively, which is kind of typical what we hope to achieve, not only with DDA attribution, but also a smart bidding strategy. All right, over with our automation part and moving on to a quite exciting product update, which is the launch, or maybe just a rebranding and unification of different ads types that we had, which we will now be calling the responsive display ads. So what does the responsive display ad do? It will take a long headline, short headlines, logos, marketing images, and descriptions, and forward them into the perfect display ad for every auction, every user, every device. It is also very much reliant on machine learning, just as pretty much everything here at Google. So we have a machine learning model, an algorithm that will select the assets based on the prediction of the performance that they will have. The assets will then be served. We will see what the actual results they drove. Those actual results will then loop back into the system and be compared to the prediction that was made at time of the auction. And the model will also be updated based on the results, so we can see the difference between the actual result and the prediction, and the further prediction will be updated for further action based on the learning that was done. So a very classical case of machine learning, which I think is really cool to see for ad assets and ad tabs. So how do you get started with this type of ad? You first of all gather assets. So kind of like any type of automated creatives, the inputs are going to be extremely important. So make sure that you have at least 5 headlines, 5 images, 5 short descriptions, a good logo that can also be in square shaped, a headline, and just neutral your business name. You can set up then your responsive display ad via the Google Ads interface, any type of API or the editor tool. Monitor the result for 1 or 2 weeks, and then use the asset report, the asset reporting, to refresh your assets where needed every 4 to 6 weeks. So you will be seeing which assets are low performing, high performing, and you can optimize accordingly. So basically, some of this might sound familiar to you. It's because the responsive display ad is really just combining 2 legacy ad formats, which is the responsive ad and then the smart display ad. So this is the new format for display, and we're really taking the best of both worlds. So we're taking the multi-asset support, the asset reporting that we had in Smart Display. This will move on to the responsive display ad. We're taking over the Google Ads editor support, but also just the responsiveness of the ad type from the responsive ads, and just taking all of that good stuff under one new ad. To give you a little bit of a sneak peek of how it looks like, you can see that for different devices, the ad will look differently, that it will use different assets and inputs according to the space that we get, and that means that it gives you like a lot of option, and just make sure that your ad, especially within a very broad display network, will always look its best. So the rollout is done. You should be able to see this into your accounts, and please feel free to start experimenting with it. Let it run for at least 2 weeks and then report back to us as to what you found. All right, moving on to the questions. So I'm going to be looking now if you have any type of questions. So at the moment, I don't really see any questions, which means it was all very clear, which is great. Okay, cool. Well, thank you for tuning in then today. I wish you a great rest of the week, and we'll be back in 2 weeks for another automation news bulletin, and wish you the best until then. Thank you. Bye.